Well, okay, I appreciate Dr. DelCurto, DelCurto,
DelCurto, yes.
DelCurto, for joining us to give us a presentation on beef production systems, and I really do look forward to this as a livestock producer, trying to make the most out of my range and raise the best beef cattle in Montana. So I'm hoping that Dr. DelCurto will help me improve my operation, and I look forward to this presentation. Thank you.
Very good. And if you guys don't mind, I'm going to get up and close my door so I don't disrupt all my neighbors. So I'll be right back. Well, as already been said, I'm Tim DelCurto. I'm a professor here in the Department of Animal and Range Science. And also, I was fortunate enough to be selected as the Nancy Cameron Chair about 4 years ago. And if you're unfamiliar with that, the chair was established by initially the Cameron family, but then Montana Stock Growers. I think the Bear Foundation, Key Bank, Northwest Farm Credit Service, all those provide money that helps support my program, which currently I have about 10 graduate students, a postdoc, and a number of different projects going. Based on the input I got from you folks earlier was that you kind of wanted to hear a little bit about what we're doing at Montana State in terms of beef cattle production, as well as both teaching and research. So I'm going to do a really quick presentation and then hopefully open it up for questions about what our program looks like. I think first of all, here at Montana State, we have roughly 400 undergraduate students. Of the 400, I would tell you that roughly about 100 of them are ranch kids, production and management kinds of majors. We have about 100 that are science, that are looking towards graduate school or veterinary medicine or something like that. We just initiated last year the Dan Scott Ranch Management Program, which is designed to create opportunities for young people to go out and help out with the management and operation of ranches here in Montana, as well as the rest of the Pacific Northwest. We also have a rangeland wildlife management degree program where there's roughly about 75 students in that. I already told you a bit about my position, which is supposed to be beef cattle industry centric, but I'm just one of roughly about 20 faculty here at Montana State that work both in the range and animal science programs. Again, we have about 400 students, about 100 of them in management or Dan Scott ranch management students. About 100 in science, about 100 in equine science, and then roughly 75 in range, and then about 25 to 30 graduate students. Just to give you some facts about the U.S. beef cattle industry, and I'm doing this primarily to put Montana in context. The average age of producers throughout the U.S. industry is 58.3 years of age, which a lot of you already know. It's an industry that certainly got some age to it. Although I think Montana kind of defies that curve. We're a bit younger in Montana, and I think there's more opportunities here in Montana than perhaps other countries or other states around the area. Oddly enough, we're an industry that has over 700,000 cow-calf producers. Of those, 91% are family-owned. And so at least from a cow-calf perspective, we're fairly diverse with number of operators. But as most of you know, that narrows down to an industry with really 4 packers that generate roughly 80% of all the beef product in this country. So it's an interesting industry that's not vertically integrated with lots of cow-calf folks narrowing down to just a handful of packers, which as most of you know, if you think about current controversies, what's happening in the industry. We currently have a Justice Department investigation of our packers and prices that we see at the ranches versus what we see in the retail case. Oddly enough, the average herd size of the cattle ranch throughout the U.S. is 40 cows, which might seem small to us folks in Montana, but it's not unusual if you live in a state like Missouri or Kentucky or Arkansas. We have 26,000 feedlot operations, 80% of those are family owned, 64,098 dairies in 2018, but as most of you know, the dairy industry's really struggled in the last couple of years. Milk prices came back up, but the consumption of fluid milk in North America has been declining. But, you know, one of the things we often don't talk much about, dairy cattle actually contribute a little bit over 20% of beef products. And so we need to really include them when we talk about the beef cattle industry. And these are all data that you can easily find. National Cattlemen's Beef Association has it. In fact, just in the last couple of months, they've actually put up more current numbers than this, but this is what I had. Montana beef industry, agriculture, you know, is Montana's leading industry, and cow-calf production is the largest agricultural segment. We're number 7 in the United States in beef females at 1.5 million head. And we're the number 1 seed stock producing state in the United States. Roughly 1 in 5 bulls sold in the U.S. Comes from Montana. And when you consider that the United States is clearly the leader in beef cattle production, you know, we're obviously a world leader, particularly when it comes to Angus genetics. So that should make you happy, at least from that perspective. Big part of what this state does. And I might add, one of the big changes that I'm involved with here is we're converting our Montana state beef herd over to a registered Angus herd. And currently we have roughly about 60 females. We have 50 commercial cows that we put embryos in this spring, and we're looking forward to at some point converting our entire campus herd here over to registered Angus, which would be roughly about 250 females we'd breed each spring, at least in this program. For us, you know, I think it reflects more what's going on in the state. We also have way more information about these cow herds by going through the American Angus Association registry and working with their data set in terms of genetics and tools for selection. Okay, already talked about 20% of Angus bulls. 1.5 million head of cows generally creates a fairly substantial, you know, roughly $1.5 billion. Overall cattle or livestock sales in Montana is a little over $2 billion, and a majority of that coming from cow-calf. In this state, we have 27,500 farms and ranches that generate at least 1,000. So, you know, obviously the importance of agriculture in Montana is fairly large. Okay.
Doctor, can I interrupt to ask questions, or do you want to hold them until the end?
Go ahead. I'm in no particular schedule.
Okay, so I've been reading about, I'm an MSU alum, and Good. I've been reading about MSU's Angus breeding program. And, yes. You know, there's other state universities like Colorado State and Pennsylvania and others that are actually trying to breed and sell genetics, right. Premier genetics. Is that your goal here, or just more research on the production?
Our goal, to be honest, we're trying to work within our resources. What we have here on campus is roughly about 1,000 acres of ground here in the Gallatin Valley, which is where we raise basically our young animals, our replacement heifers, all the way up, and we have our first calf heifers here, right here at the university farm. And then once we preg them and they're bred for a second calf, they go out to Red Bluff. Red Bluff is 13,500 acres. It's an operation that we can run cattle on that virtually 10 months out of the year. And so what we're trying to do with ours, we're really not, I guess what I would call mainstream purebred, but instead We're looking at purebred cattle that fit Montana range environment. That's entirely forage based, with the exception of roughly about 60 days where we're calving and we have them in confinement. I don't know if that makes sense. You know, it's sort of funny. Yeah, I'm aware of what CSU is doing. I did my PhD at Kansas State, so I was very familiar with the purebred operations they had there. In our case, we're May calving cow herd, which is a little different than a lot of purebred folks. But that's primarily designed so that we essentially at Red Bluff will graze them through the winter period. We do look at optimal supplementation strategies for that winter forage base, but we're trying to do kind of a purebred production from a very sustainable forage-based production system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And your calving in May, you know, I often tell people that a range scientist tells a guy to have their calves 4 to 6 weeks old on the best grass.
And that's a
and
pretty good strategy.
calving in May is that time. Is that why you're doing it?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. One of the things too is you know, we balance sort of beef cattle production with sustainable range management. And one of the challenges we had just on our own ranch is when we were calving in March, up until this year, we calved in March. We ended up, the pastures where we calved in, close to our calving barns and our facilities where we could assist if we got into a good old Montana snowstorm. Actually, this is not a scientific term, but they're pretty hammered. You know, we had grazed them pretty hard. The perennial grasses were gone. So we wanted to kind of move to a calving date that allows us to calve out on range more and kind of rotate the use of those pastures better. But at the same time, yeah, minimize winter hay cost. You know, we look down the road and we try to be proactive and go, well, where's the industry going? One of our challenges is labor, and labor at calving is a challenge. The other challenge is, you know, a lot of our ranches don't have the size and skills to afford $150,000 swathers, $100,000 tractors, and things like that. So if we can encourage more, you know, reliance, you know, extending the grazing season, less reliance on hay and things like that, we feel like our research programs will be of more value. Not to all producers, but certainly to some of them. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's kind of our approach.
Yeah, absolutely does.
Good.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, keep doing that. You know, this is actually my 30th year in academia. I managed the range livestock stations at Oregon State for 23 years before coming here 4 years ago. But when I look at beef production systems in the Western U.S., you know, I think we're confined by the forages and the resources we have. You know, one of the things that becomes obvious, this is cows at the USDA research station between Burns and Bend, Oregon. It's the Northern Great Basin. It's about 11-inch precip zone. The entire region is greater than 4,000 foot of elevation. The growing season's roughly 90 days, and that's basically just the period from the last killing frost in the spring to the first killing frost in the fall. Unfortunately, they don't get any summer precip, and so the grasses actually stop growing when the moisture in the soil runs out. Montana's not a lot different. You know, we have a little better forage base, obviously, than this, but we still are looking at 90 to 120-day growing seasons. Much of the state is relatively high elevation, and so how do we design beef production systems that fit that, and in many cases, find ideal cows that can utilize this forage? But it's really funny when people talk about efficiency of cows. In most cases, the most efficient cows are just ones that breed every year in this kind of environment. And then we can talk about production and things like that after that. This is just a 30,000 foot thing, but when you look at the Western U.S., one of the things that strikes you on this topography map is everything in brown here is greater than 1,000 meters, which is roughly 3,300 foot elevation and higher. And you can look at Montana, most of Montana, that elevation. and most of the West. You do see areas, in the Pacific Northwest, the Willamette Valley, the Central Valley of California, that's lower elevation, but not surprisingly, there's no cattle in those areas. They're basically primarily for farming. So most of the beef cattle systems in the West are basically in this area of brown, which makes our systems different than the Midwest and the Southeast and places like that. It's just a very different environment to run cattle. Usually requires different kinds of cows to fit that. To make matters worse, this is just a precip map, and everything here in kind of the light green to yellow is areas with less than 20 inches of precip. You can see most of Montana is less than that. And I would venture to say most of Montana is between 13 and 17 inches, depending on where you're at. The only places with higher precip, now there really isn't any cattle because you're really talking about the top of the Rocky Mountains in that region. And so relatively low precip. And in some areas, it's less than 10 inches, these light colored areas. So, our production systems are different. We're working within an environment that sometimes has some really exceptional extremes, and we're kind of all aware of that. So, basically we're looking at research that balances multiple values, forage management, forage-based beef production systems that account for ecological function. One of our biggest challenges is water optimization. And in many cases, how do we manage our rangeland forages so that when it does rain, that vegetation that remains on site captures the water, stores it, and then releases it at a rate that works best for us. So that's why, optimal use, how much forage can you take, how much should you leave, and also the right kinds of species. We're finding out deep-rooted perennial grasses are ideal because they capture that water and they take it down to the depth of the roots in the system. And so that's one of the things we try to do as we balance beef cattle production with sustainable range management. Also, soil and nutrient retention. There's a lot of data now coming out that's suggesting that if we can build up organic matter in our soils, we can actually retain more water, more nutrients, and increase production of some of these native rangelands. And then how do we manage cattle use in these extensive environments? So we're doing a lot of research looking at how cattle use rangeland landscapes, and how do we optimize the use of these while maintaining these other values. And then finally, how do we, I think most ranches, we're a family-based beef cattle industry, family ranches. No one wants to do something in one year that's going to impact production in the next. And so how do we optimize vegetation production, but still harvest that for a healthy food product? One thing that we're doing here in Montana that's unique, and I've kind of learned in the last 4 years, 2018, and 2019 was educational for me. And what we found out was that when it gets very cold, most of our, National Research Council recommendations for feeding cows go right out the window. I think about both those winters. When it's 20, 30 below zero and you throw a wind in, it's tough to feed cows. And for most of us, I think we remember that well, particularly the winter of 2017, 2018. That seemed to go on forever, started in November, went all the way through. 2018, 2019 was a little bit better in that it was a normal winter all the way up until February. And then we had roughly 90 days of just frigid weather, in many cases 20 degrees below normal. So one of the things we're doing with a lot of our winter research is we're looking at body condition change, cow weight change as a function of winter environment. And what we're finding out is the old beef NRCs are quite outdated. And in fact, you look at the last time that our National Research Council looked at the effective environment on nutrient requirements was 1981. And really all they do is suggest that you need to feed, cows need more energy with cold temperatures, and that's really all they focus on. They don't say anything about protein, minerals, or vitamins. But what we've observed in those 2 hard winters in particular is that during these winters, we tend to see a lot more health problems in our calves that spring. Things like selenium, zinc deficiencies, things like that appear to be enhanced or magnified when you have a really cold, difficult winter. Right now, most of our models just really relate to temperature and hair coat, and most of them are very limited in respect to precipitation or wind. In fact, I remember I had a call from a producer up on the High Line, and it was that day, it was 35 below in the morning with fairly strong winds. I think the wind chill factor is like minus 55. And I went to our NRC models and tried to run what those cows needed, and basically they didn't work. We couldn't find a model that would tell us what that person needed to feed. And I think for people, particularly on the high line or high wind areas during these particular winters, they're very much aware of the fact that winter environment here is challenging. So what we're trying to do is take all of our data, some of the new technology we have, and answer some of these questions that, quite frankly, have been neglected now for about 40 years. It's a pretty common scene with cattle in the winter in Montana. It's interesting. They will increase intake when it gets cold, but they physically can't, on a forage-based diet, consume enough energy to meet their needs. And so in many cases, you see loss of body condition. Some cases, you see impaired colostrum quality and things like that at birth if the winter is severe enough. Obviously, there's alternatives to that and choices that our ranchers make. You can keep them dry, keep them in good places. Sometimes you get a better start for the calf. So anyway, that's kind of an overview of some of the things we're doing. We do a lot of beef production systems research. We do a lot of what we call ranch and rangeland forage use. We're doing research where we look at trying to match the cow, the milk level, the size, and all that to an environment. Some of the stuff, I don't think I have slides on it, that we're particularly using here. We use a lot of GPS collars on our cows in these winter grazing environments. Those GPS collars tell us our settings. A lot of different universities do it different ways, but we get locations of these cows every 5 minutes, and they're typically within about 6 meter accuracy, so we know exactly where they are on the landscape. They also have what we call an activity monitor on them, and the activity monitor tells us if they're grazing, if they're lying down, if they're walking, and we've purchased about $100,000 worth of, we call them Smart Feed Pro feeder technology, but we can put these Smart Feed Pro trailers out in very extensive environments. And whenever the cow goes to the trailer and eats a supplement, it reads its EID tag in the ear of the cow. It timestamps when it's at that feed trailer. And it also has a weather station there, which tells us the temperature, the wind speed, the direction, and all that. So we're modeling how cattle use the landscape during the winter period and how the winter environment modifies that. And we're just now starting to publish some of those papers, and they're being fairly well received by the academic community. But our whole plan here is to help ranchers become more precise in how they provide nutrition to these cows that are grazing these fall and winter environments. And we're hopeful that we can provide data on the types of cows and things like that that fit best in their production system. So with that, I'll open it up to any kind of questions you guys might have. And we can talk about virtually anything, really.
So, the old timers used to tell me when I was getting going in this cattle business that when it's really, really cold out, you just need to feed them a little bit more straw. That's like putting wood on the fire.
Yeah.
But kind of what I heard from you is that they're missing not fiber, they're missing energy and protein and nutrition when it's
Yeah,
cold.
first of all, one of the things that's unique about beef cattle or any cattle, any ruminant is heat of fermentation. Sometimes you go out, particularly when there's no wind and it can be 20 below, and you look at a group of cows in a field, and they look actually perfectly content, and they are. It's really funny that the average body temperature of a cow when you temp them, we're looking for 101.6. But if you actually put your arm in the rumen, and we have roughly about 20 rumen cannulated cows here on campus, that temperature is going to vary from about 102 to 106 degrees, depending on when that animal ate. If it's immediately post-feeding, that temperature will go up all the way to 105, 106. And basically, that's just heat of that forage being fermented. The more the forage base, the greater that heat of fermentation. So that is important. But what we're finding, that old beef NRC that I showed you, that 1981 publication, suggests that if a cow goes into the winter with an average to beginning to have its winter hair coat, for every degree below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, you can increase energy 1%. And so at zero, that cow should be eating 30% more energy than what you might have fed it if it was, a 40-degree day. And they will compensate and eat more. But where we run into problems, the cattle here in Montana, particularly after extended periods of cold, will develop a really thick winter hair coat, which is good. Then the critical temperature appears to be somewhere around 18 degrees Fahrenheit. But when it gets 20, 30 below and the wind starts blowing, they physically can't eat enough forage-based rations to meet their energy needs. Now, the heat of fermentation will keep them at least warm enough, but they're not going to be able to meet those maintenance needs. And one of the things we forget about is roughly 60% of the growth of the fetus happens in the last trimester, which a cow in the last trimester needs to gain about 1 pound per day just for that growing fetus. And in some cases, when we have severe winters, that doesn't happen. They basically, move fat reserves to the fetus and ultimately end up with a thinner cow and perhaps a weaker calf at birth.
So there's a loaded question here for you. Have you done any studies or seen any on whether purebred or crossbred cattle utilize pasture feed better? Does one breed stand out as being more efficient and adapted to Montana? Be careful now.
That's a really good question, and I think I'll talk about it in real vague generalities. The truth is, obviously, crossbreeding for a commercial cowman has advantages, and that heterosis and hybrid vigor certainly comes into place. And there's been a number of studies. Colorado State comes to mind. There's still a lot of studies that talks about the virtues of crossbreeding. Beyond that, the selection of breed and breed type, really depends on what your goals and objectives are. To be honest, Angus has been a pretty versatile breed, and that's why we see 60 to 80% of all bulls in the United States generate from the Angus genetic base. It's not to say other breeds aren't good, they are. And Herefords, I grew up my family still has a ranch in northeastern Oregon, and every time when my dad was still alive, we'd drive by a field of Herefords. We had to stop and look at them because that's what he liked. But in that case, the Herefords had a fairly low milk. They bred back very well because they didn't have high milk requirements. Now, they didn't wean as big a calf as what we got when we started crossbreeding, but that cow was bred every fall. and so it depends on your nutrients, what your forage base is. It depends on, to a certain degree, personal preference. And, if you're going to retain ownership and go to the feedlot with them, or retain them all the way to the pack, or, what kind of cow you want and what kind of genetics you really. So that was pretty evasive, right?
So back to winter feeding.
Yeah.
You're kind of implying that when it's 40 below and the wind's blowing to beat hell, hay isn't enough. You got to supplement them with some other cake or liquid
Yeah.
feed.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is when we have those, the problem with these extreme winters, you don't know you had them until they're over, and so it's
Right.
hard to be prepared. I do remember the 2017, 2018 year. I did a lot of research up at our Northern Ag Research Center in Havre, and that particular year, the livestock operation was so proud that he had almost a year and a half's worth of feed, prepared that fall. And guess what? They ran out of feed and had to buy some that spring just to get their cows through it. And despite the fact they were feeding them really well, they lost a lot of condition. And basically what that tells us is that forage-based ration that we're feeding, they will actually feed, they will graze on the Thackeray Ranch all the way into January, and then feed them essentially a TMR ration from January to the 1st of March when they start ration or start calving. And it wasn't enough to hold the body condition on those cows. But that was not because the diets weren't good. They were good, but they weren't good enough to meet the energy needs of the cold stress that those cows experienced. And so
the
supplements with energy in it. But, the niche of Montana producers is always going to be a forage-based system. We just need to figure out how to tweak that in light of the environment we operate in to keep these cows at a level that we consider to be optimal production. That's not fat. That's just, how can they have healthy cows and then breed back in a timely manner to stay on our 365-day cycle.
The 2017-18 winter was followed by the 2017 grazing season.
Yeah.
And what I found, I'm a registered Angus breeder, and so I do 205-day weights, and the cows were in belly deep grass the fall of 2017, but there was no feed value in it. I mean, I think it grew to beat hell. The tap shut off in July, and it got hot as hell, and we pretty much had straw in our pastures, not grass.
Yeah.
And I think that led to the whole body condition of the cows that went through that winter of 2017-18 as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. We have a tendency, it's funny, you need to think of the 12-month production cycle. One of the interesting thing about forage production and most of our native rangelands is, a lot of us, depending on where we're at, we have bunch grass communities. And if you really look at your range forages, you'll find out that on an average year, you may only have 30% of those plants go to maturity. But some years that's not true. Some years when you have, as you were talking about, the tremendous amount of forage production, it's actually not very good. And again, you need to look at the plants. You need to look at how many of them actually have set seed and become very mature. Sometimes drought years will actually shut down growth before it gets too tall. But, the ranchers' term for it is, boy, this year we have powerful feed. And in a sense, they do as long as they have enough of it, And so the big balancing thing here is some years you get too much moisture in April, May, and June, and maybe too mild of a spring, and you get this huge amount of production, but it's not very good. And then in the other years, you'll run out of soil moisture and the plants will stop growing, but actually what's there is better. And it's dynamic. It changes from year to year, and it's just part of our production systems. It makes ranching here a heck of a lot harder than it is in like Nebraska or Kansas or something like that.
So another question for you is fire. I've heard some presentations that talk about using fire in different spots of native pasture to improve your overall pasture. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, It's really funny. One of the nice things about academia is you get to travel a lot. I did my PhD at Kansas State University, and we I worked with our range beef cattle program there, and we're working in Tallgrass Prairie. And Tallgrass Prairie was unlike anything. My family's ranch was in eastern Oregon. We had forage production that on a good year was around 1,000 pounds per acre. First time I ever went out on the Tallgrass Prairie, that year they'd had a really good wet year. They had roughly 6,000 pounds per acre of native forage, but most of it was warm season grasses and things like that. So, there's a lot of it, but it's not very good value. So the work I did was mostly how do you supplement that forage? You try to optimize the intake of it, digestion of it by providing a protein supplement that accommodates that. But I guess getting back to your question, in the Tallgrass Prairie, they burn the Tallgrass Prairie virtually every year. And it's really interesting. Areas that weren't grazed one year, when they burn it, of course, those are the areas that burn the hottest. And the next year, that was the areas that cows would focus on because there's a little bit better forage production. Also, whenever you burn, I think a lot of people don't think much about this, but you volatilize the carbohydrates and the nitrogen of the plant. But on site, you leave the and the ash is typically minerals, and so those get enhanced or incorporated into the soil better. And so that next year you'll actually see a flush of growth, and in some cases, the vegetation where it's burned removes that woody material, that dormant material, and it's more attractive than to animals in areas that burn versus unburned. Got to be a little careful with fire though, because sometimes depending on the heat of the fire, it can damage perennial grasses. And that's why we have this debate between BLM and Forest Service about, how long to wait post-fire with grazing. And so those are all interesting questions.
So when do you burn? That was kind of what you were leading up to.
Yeah, I think if you're going to use burning as a way to manage your pastures, you got to pick a time, obviously, when you can manage the fire. And I would say right now in August in eastern Montana, I saw where it's been 100 degrees, not a good time to burn. But if you can burn where you can keep, basically remove that above ground vegetation without the fire getting away from you and being too hot, and not for it getting so hot that it's going to damage the plants, you can actually use it as a pretty effective tool. But like I said, it's one of those that I think just in terms of liability, a lot of people shy away from, but yet in some areas, they use it quite a bit as a management tool.
Do you have to have growth after the fire before winter?
It's a good question. It depends on the particular species you're talking about. With most, no. If you wait until after that plant has finished growing, its root reserves and all that's established, and so it should be fine. Although you do expose the crown of the plant to cold weather, but if you're in an area that gets snow, it's probably protected anyway. So, like I said, it's site specific how you do that. When I was in my previous life, I was at Oregon State University, and I did a lot of work with the Forest Service. And at that time, one of their big goals was fuels reduction. So what they wanted to do is do logging where they thinned the overstory, and then they'd go in and do a controlled understory burn with the theory of making it more productive or perhaps moving it back to what would be a more natural state. And what they found is they made the understories more more dominated by grasses, made it a bit more productive. But one of the things that surprised us is it ended up, there's more grasses, there's more production. So in some ways you could have more livestock on those lands. But without the shrubs and the forbs and things like that that were in the unburned sites, typically by August or September, it wasn't very good. And so the control sites that had, things like vaccinium, which basically is a fancy way of saying huckleberry, stuff like that, You know, you can graze sites that have those woody vegetation that really holds diets well into the fall. But if you burn it, you'll remove those kind of species. So we have to be kind of thoughtful about how we use fire. But you have to understand, I for about 23 years managed range livestock stations. So I had to work with the rangeland ecologists as well as the livestock people on these projects. So one of the things, you know, I guess throw something out that I think is really fascinating to me is sort of this argument about cow size, which I find to be really, really pretty interesting. It's one that I think only old professors like me would be willing to talk about. But, you know, generally we're certainly finding that there are cow sizes that fit certain environments better. But, you know, a good example, our Red Bluff ranch is mostly dryland rangelands. It's fairly low precip zone, 13 to 15 inches, depending on where you're at. Vegetation right now is pretty dry. We're running 1,350 pound cows out there, between 600 pound calves fairly easily. And we're getting pregnancy rates of around, you know, 90 to 95%, depending on the year. What that tells me with those pregnancy rates and that level of production is that a 1,350 pound cow is doing fine in that environment. And so I sometimes look at some of these cow size papers and wonder, you know, if one, they rarely get published in referee journals. They tend to end up in popular press, which just spurs the debate among the livestock industry. But I think sometimes we make too much of an issue about cow size, particularly for our Montana range environments. Now, if I was running cattle in Nevada, where production might be 500 pounds per acre, those cows in that environment really have to trot from plant to plant, and their cow size might be a more important factor.
So you say your average cow size is 1,350. Is that a uniform herd you have, or do you have enough diversity in size that you could actually compare?
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure if anyone has truly a uniform herd.
Yeah.
One thing that we've done with our Red Bluff herd as well as our Ag Research Center herd is just characterize the entire cow herd in terms of weight and body condition. And, you know, one of the studies we did right when I first got here is one of the things I kept hearing from ranchers is like, I want all my cows to weigh 50% of their body weight. And you know what? In theory, that sounds like a really, really a good production goal, is that if I have a 1,200 pound cow, they should wean, you know, a 600 pound calf and a 1,400 pound cow, 700 pound calf. But what we found out is that's a really good theory, but doesn't apply well to your cow herd. Because what we found is our young cows, those 2, 3, and 4-year-old cows, always have the highest weaning rate percent, even though their calves are smaller than those older cows. But it's because those cows are smaller. And so the Haver herd, for instance, will range anywhere from, you know, 1,100 pound cows up to 1,700 pound cows, just as a function of age, as you go from 2-year-old cow to a 10-year-old cow. And so it's a really cool metric. It's just too bad that it'd be really, really difficult to apply on the ranch. And unfortunately, and I'm a classic example of this, whether we like it or not, as you age, you put on weight. How much salad you eat. So.
Well, I appreciate your time.
Okay.
I did learn a lot. Thank you. And we'll be posting this up on our website for everybody to watch on their own time. And I look forward to meeting you face to face someday, Doctor.